when we're all kind of in a lockdown position in our homes. Now, in our very first book, in our very first 2 chapters that we started yesterday, in the very first book, we learned about Liz, who is our main character. She's about 32 years old. She has a son named Luke. Her grandfather is Grandpa Lucas. Her sister is Megan. And we learned that her husband was killed tragically in the timber mill that her family owns, and that his body was never found as it got captured in the logs and rushed down the river. She is holding out that Thomas will come home someday, but it's been almost a year. Now it's 1856 and it's in Louisiana, and that is the drumbeat beating pretty heavily for the beginning of the Civil War and also the presidential election of Buchanan. Of course, Lincoln came in 1860, and that was when the Civil War actually began. So the family feels like the grandfather that they need to sell the timber mill, and they need to get a buyer who will pay gold for it, not get Union money and not get Confederate money. And he wants to sell out, and they want to go west. In the United States at that time, there was a big push to go west. And with that, each state, becoming a state, got to have the different rights and the different people in the Senate and in Congress. And it was a very big deal whether it would be a slave state or a non-slave state. They didn't want more on one side or the other, because that would unbalance the voting when it came to different states' rights. And slavery was a huge issue of the day. So Grandpa Lucas thought that they needed to sell the timber mill and go west. We find out in the first 2 chapters also that he doesn't have the sale final for the timber mill, but he wants to go ahead and send his wagon loads full of granddaughters on west. And he has asked Thomas, one of the timber mill workers, to go with the women. So that's kind of where we're at in chapters 1 and 2. And we're going to start in with chapter 3. And those of you that have the novels, we're going to be on page 31. Now, if you're interested in the novels, you can go right to our website, which is squareandasquare.com, and order them. Any of that come from our warehouse will be signed and dated for you. If you like to do the e-readers, you can just go to your favorite location and look by author Jodi Barrows, and it's the Threads of Change series. There's 3 of them available now, and the 4th one I'm working on. We don't have a date yet of when that will be done, but we're hoping it'll be done soon. So I hope you enjoy the story. Liz imagined the stagecoach bouncing recklessly along the rocky, rutted road that led the way to a whole new life for her cousins. She pictured Abby and Emma trying for 2 solid days to sit upright in the leather seats, and she knew Emma would have given up long before Abby. After endlessly pricking her fingers as she stitched, Emma would have folded up her work and placed it back in her sewing pouch, while Abby stared at the same 2 pages of her book for miles upon miles. Abby, the school teacher, sat tall in her seat, in Liz's imagination anyway, looking almost as fresh as the day they had left. Emma, on the other hand, likely felt all 5 days of wear, dirty and tired, and longing to arrive at their destination. Part of Abby's decision to go west with her grandfather had been Emma's rebellious disposition. Tensions had been so heavy back at home that Liz wondered if Emma had even told her father goodbye. Abby had written that she hoped Emma might come into her own during this adventure west. Abby, calm and composed and patient, had always seemed to occupy the flip side of Emma's coin. She never blurted out any words for which she had to later apologize or try to take back. Emma, on the other hand, seemed to explode at times. She often slammed doors and spilled out things she didn't really mean. They were so different in every way, from looks to attitudes and to dreams. Liz and Megan stood anxiously, fidgeting about in their puffy dresses, both of them with anticipation, wiggling much more than 2 grown ladies should. Liz felt a little silly for it, but she couldn't help herself. Grandpa Lucas had dropped them off at the general store earlier and then parked the wagons nearby. "I see the stage," Megan called out with girlish excitement. Liz jumped a little as Megan squeezed her hand a little too hard. Liz pulled back slightly. "Megan." "Oh, sorry." "There it is. I see it now," Liz said, pointing as the stage pulled to a stop. She caught sight of Abby and Emma looking out the stagecoach windows, and Megan sprang into action as she rushed to the stage. Liz scurried close behind, both of them holding up the edges of their dresses so they wouldn't trip as they hurried. The stagecoach door opened, and the Wilkes sisters stepped down to the dirt road, dust still swirling about. Their Sunday dresses looked slightly wrinkled, but the hats pinned on their heads sat perched straight and proper. With tired smiles, the girls greeted the others with joyous hugs. "You look wonderful," Liz spoke, her arm around Abby, "but I'm sure you're both exhausted from your travels." The communication from the women drew the attention of bystanders. Some smiled, and a few gentlemen tipped their hats as the four women bustled up the steps. As the ladies chatted and hugged for the third or fourth time, Grandpa Lucas and Chet, one of the mill workers, grabbed the trunks and carpet bags, loaded them into the wagons. Each man moved back and forth, taking several loads. When they finally finished, the two men exchanged big smiles. "How many granddaughters are we picking up?" Chet asked. Grandpa Lucas looked at the loaded wagons and shook his head. Finally, he slapped Chet on the back and said, "See you in a while." Lucas's four granddaughters held up traffic on the boardwalk, all of them chatting at once, but all of them were keeping up with every conversation. Abby and Emma both kissed their grandfather and thanked him. Emma looked deeply at her grandfather as if she wanted to etch every detail about him in her mind. Liz smiled as she watched them. Grandpa Lucas still looked as spry for a man of his age. The repayment for a lifetime's uncompromising work, she supposed. He had many years ahead of him simply because he refused to quit. Even now, he still put out nearly the same amount of work he had in his prime. Liz loved the twinkle in his eyes and his big smile. Lucas Maley was a man of risk and reached for what he wanted. His spirit was contagious, and Liz wanted it too. "You ladies go on down to the bakery and take your time. When you're ready, Chet and I will drive you home." Liz chatted happily with her sister and cousins as they strolled down the sidewalk to Granny Smith's tea room and bakery. Abby and Emma looked about the town of LeComte and seemed intrigued by it. The wheels of passing wagons crunched over small rocks covering the street. Horses were tied to most every hitching post. They stomped their hooves and swished their tails, snickering and snorting in the hope of attracting attention and receiving a treat. A brown horse with random white spots made eye contact with Liz, watching her as the girl strode along. He let out a stern huff and stamped his hoof. Emma stopped and rubbed the horse's velvet nose. She had always loved horses. Liz recalled Isaac, the stable hand at her cousin's plantation, teaching them how smart horses were and how they never forgot a person's kindness or lack thereof. Emma winked at the horse and hurried to catch up with the others. She looped her arm through Liz's as they stopped in front of a large glass shop window. Chet strolled down the wooden sidewalk. Chet strolled down the wooden sidewalk up ahead of them. The nail planks creaked beneath his feet as he walked. Liz caught him watching after the rustle of their four long skirts as they swished toward the tea room. He stepped off the boardwalk and pulled out his handkerchief, folding it carefully and then dipping the end of it into the horse trough. He wiped his face and neck and put the damp cloth into his back pocket. As the girls headed into the tea room, Liz watched Chet head toward the saloon down the street. Chet, born a Texan, had moved to Louisiana at 22, and Liz remembered hearing him say that he stumbled upon LeComte for no particular reason. After a few weeks later, he had met Lucas and gone to work at the mill. Chet had been respected and paid well, but Grandpa Lucas had said the man had desperately wanted to go back to Texas. He said it was in his blood. The sweet and enticing fragrance inside the tea room made Liz remember how hungry she was. She imagined Emma and Abby were half-starved by now. Emma rubbed her leg and commented that it felt sore from the trip. For 2 days, she explained, it hit the side of the stagecoach until now it is tender and bruised. Liz noticed the little half-moons that hung under her cousin's eyes, and she smiled as she thought that they paraded their fatigue around like a little girl in a fancy dress. They likely felt horrible, mostly from the poor sleeping conditions and the half hour of excitement since their arrival had disguised their tiredness. But now, as normalcy set in, their exhaustion appeared unmistakable. The four of them sat down at a white linen-covered table. They ordered dessert and tea, and the cousins took turns relating everything that had happened to them since they had last exchanged letters. They were brought up on all of the latest news, including most of the plans for their journey west. They talked about the future and recent quilting projects, wagons, flowers, men, lacy hats, and hairstyles. At a break in the conversation, Abby pulled off her thin gloves and looked over at Liz. Abby seemed overwhelmed by the heat. "Abby, I think it's time to start home." Chet cautiously entered the tea room just then as the ladies finished the last of their crumbly pastries. He walked with the confidence that comes from a shot of whiskey, and he touched his hat with a greeting as he reached the table. "Hello, Chet," Liz said cheerfully. "What perfect timing. We're about ready to leave." Chet smiled as his chocolate brown eyes went to each female. He looked handsome in his brown cowboy hat and green cotton shirt. His dark blonde hair hung loosely over his hat and hung loosely under his hat, and his boots were dark and slightly dusty from the constant wear. "I'd like for you to meet my cousins, Chet. This is Abby, and this is Emma, her younger sister." "Ma'am, ma'am," he said, tipping the brim of his hat twice, greeting each of them. "Nice to meet you," they both said, almost in unison. "Nice to meet you also." Chet shifted his weight to his other hip, causing his belt buckle to shine in the afternoon sun. "Well, I'll be out front with the wagons when you ladies are ready to leave." "Thank you, Chet," Liz replied. "We'll be right along." He smiled toward Emma and gave her an extra tip of his hat as he headed out the door. Emma smiled back, her cheeks blushing red. "Oh," Megan teased, "I think Chet is sweet on you, Emma." "No, really? You think so?" "Yes, really." "Maybe so, Emma," Liz teased. "I saw the way he looked at you." Emma looked dazed and slightly embarrassed. "Now, who is Chet again?" Megan giggled. "He works at the mill. You'll see him again later, I'm sure." Liz quickly paid with the money that Lucas had given her, and they walked out to meet the men at the wagon. Like each consecutive morning before, Lucas rose first and started the coffee in the first skillet of bacon. "The smell of bacon is better than any alarm," he often told Thomas, just about the time the girls trotted down the stairs to the table, sleepy-eyed and ready to eat. The same trick had come to work on Luke as well. After Claire had passed away, Megan started making the biscuits, and Liz oversaw the eggs and the general needs of getting everyone fed. Caleb and Thomas had started joining the family for breakfast each day, even when Caleb had married into the Maley family. Lucas ran the family timber mill straight from his morning breakfast table. Thomas supposed that Liz and Megan had both learned the timber business while pouring coffee and flipping bacon. Liz said once that she believed more things in life are caught rather than taught, and that was certainly the case as the family trade passed down from generation to generation. Gathering around that breakfast table for the organization of the day's responsibilities had become a Maley family tradition. A bright, warm sun greeted the family on this morning. The clear blue sky boasted a few puffy clouds floating about. No breeze fluttered the curtains on the open window, and when the sunlight crossed the front porch and peeked through the windows, Thomas usually followed. He tried never to show up late for his first cup of coffee. He moseyed through the back door and greeted Lucas. Luke sat across from him, eating in complete silence as usual. Thomas grabbed the coffee cup, poured the strong black liquid, and joined the silent breakfast table. He knew that the morning conversation would begin once Lucas completed his reading. Lucas's Bible sat open to the book of Nehemiah. He looked up and greeted Thomas as he poured more coffee into the old man's cup. "I don't recall ever reading that particular book in the Bible," Thomas commented. Lucas swallowed his coffee and set the half-full cup back down. "One of my favorites. I've read it often." "Oh?" Thomas replied. "Why?" "An old man does his best work," he chuckled, "and he doesn't hesitate to tell a group of women how to help with it." Luke spoke for the first time that morning. "Tell me the story, Grandpa." Thomas leaned one arm on the table and prepared to listen to what Lucas would say. Well, Nehemiah had a big vision. He felt led by God to rebuild the city walls of Jerusalem. He made a plan, oversaw the work, financed it, and he prayed a lot. This story tells me to dream big, stay focused, get to work, refuse to give up, and always include God in every step along the way. "What else?" Luke asked. Lucas looked at his audience and continued. He had every reason to give up on his dream. He didn't think about the obstacles, but looked toward the goal. The workers got tired and overwhelmed, and the townspeople were negative. Some even wanted to kill him. He included both the women and the children in the plan, and working together, they accomplished the goal. Thomas said as he leaned back in his chair. "I like this man. Sounds like I need to read this book for myself." "That's what we have, Grandpa. We have a big goal to go west, and with lots of women." Luke's voice grew louder at the end. Thomas and Lucas laughed out loud. "Speaking of the women, aren't they late coming down today?" Thomas asked. Usually breakfast was in full swing by now. "I heard them half the night talking and laughing like little schoolgirls. Guess coffee and bacon is going to be it this morning. We can cut some bread from that loaf. Butter and blackberry jam will fix it up right." Thomas stood to get the bread and a knife. Luke got the jam and a spoon from the basket. About that time, they heard Lucas's 4 granddaughters on the stairs. Megan and Abby were in the kitchen first, and with Liz and Emma just a few steps behind. Abby, the tallest and thinnest of the 4 women, wore her brown hair pinned securely at the back of her head. She definitely has the poise of a schoolteacher, Thomas thought. "I see the Maley breakfast ritual is as it should be," Abby said as she greeted her grandfather with a kiss on the cheek. "The smell of bacon is the best way to wake up. I had forgotten." Thomas figured Emma might be too young to remember much, but the love and warmth of the home. She smiled and greeted her grandpa Lucas with a kiss as well. You men give up on breakfast this morning?" Liz asked as she put the teapot on the burner and stirred the flame under it. "Oh," she continued, "Thomas, do you remember my cousins, Abby and Emma Wilkes?" Thomas stood and greeted the Mississippi cousins. "Yes, it's been a while, ladies." "Sit down, girls," Lucas commanded. "There's plenty of bacon and bread. Get your tea ready and let's talk a few things over. Let's get everyone up to speed around here." With their plates sitting in front of them, full of bacon and bread, the Wilkes sisters watched their grandpa as he prepared to speak. "I'm pleased Abby and Emma are joining us. I wish your parents shared your views. As you all know, I firmly believe the southern states will withdraw from the Union soon. With a presidential election before us, the time is upon us. I also have a buyer for the timber mill." Every face focused on Lucas, and not a bite had been taken. The seriousness of selling the family mill and the unrest in the South, as well as an extended journey west, seemed to weigh upon each person with both excitement and apprehension. It seems all of our plans are falling into place, Lucas, Thomas said. After talking with Chet and the stage driver, I think it will take 5 or 6 weeks to get to Fort Worth. Yes, Lucas continued, and he looked directly at Abby and Emma. From our letters, I assume you know the military is leaving the fort abandoned. A freight system and mercantile is badly needed there. That area has seen growth with ranches and a few farms, and I see it as the business opportunity we are looking for. They are expecting us and quite excited about it all. Fort Worth has the ability and desire to grow into a proper community. The teapot on the stove started to whistle, and Liz got up to make the hot tea for the women. Coffee isn't their morning choice, Thomas observed. Emma started to eat, watching Abby as she asked, I heard that the cavalry is moving west to fight the Comanches. Does this mean we won't have any problems with Indians? That's been my greatest concern of our move. Most likely, we won't see any, but they are still out there. We could get worried about it, but I choose to be smart with our choices. We won't provoke them if we see them, and we'll stay together. Lucas's expression darkened as he added, I repeat, always stay together. I have also been in contact with a small group of Texas Rangers. I made arrangements for them to meet up with your wagon train at the border. They will continue on with you to the fort. Abby felt a little better and took a deep breath. As each family member prepared their breakfast plates at the melee table, they seemed to fall into their own thoughts of the adventure before them, and Thomas was no exception. Liz interrupted his thoughts as she verbalized a list of the tasks she needed to complete, as well as how many days she needed to accomplish that list. Dishes and glass cups will be packed in the sawdust, hopefully keeping them in one place over the bumpy wagon trail ahead, she said to no one in particular. We'll need one wagon alone for Megan's fabric and new sewing machine. There are trunks to pack, food to prepare, and all of the barn supplies need to find a place. She looked as if her mind had set to swirling without a pencil in front of her to organize it. She smoothed out the skirt of her blue cotton dress with its crocheted collar as if she might hop up and tackle all 6 wagons at this very moment. Young Luke seemed more troubled by the looming Civil War than about what he might pack to take on the journey. Like his namesake, Luke dreamed of open territory, fresh and green, somewhere untouched and unchanged, where bison roamed and stallions galloped, a place in the West where adventure saturated every day and Indians settled on mountaintops and deep in the valleys. Thomas smiled, realizing Luke wasn't frightened by any of it. Lucas lifted an eyebrow at Thomas. I'll have to get gold for the sale of the timber mill. Any other currency is just too unstable with the Civil War so close to exploding. After all, essentially, they were fleeing from this possible war, which according to Luke's assessment would devastate the mill operation. He had a keen understanding of the politics of the day from the many newspapers he regularly read. Thomas knew it just about broke the old man's heart to sell the timber mill, his only way of life. On the last fishing trip they had taken with Luke, Lucas had told them, this is what life is all about. Take a risk, see if you can fly. Regardless of the outcome or what may develop, it is better to try than to always have wondered. We almost finished all of the blackberry jam, Megan commented as Abby reached for it. I know, Liz said, surprised. We should grow our own blackberries again, Megan said, when we get to Texas. Do you think they'll grow in Texas? Emma asked. Surely they will grow, Megan said, and she turned to Liz. Don't you think so? I don't know for certain, Liz replied, but I can't imagine breakfast without our blackberry jam. The women all looked down at the generous layer of jam that covered each slice of warm bread. Thomas smiled at Luke as they watched and listened to the jam conversation between them. Too bad we'll miss the last berry picking season here, Liz said. We have 6 wagons full of supplies to drive, Lucas interrupted. So I've hired John and Blue from the mill to help drive the 2 extra wagons. Chet is from Texas. He knows the area well, and he will ride scout for us. Thomas gulped down the last of his coffee as Lucas continued. I'll be there as soon as the sale of the mill is finalized. The new owners need to be comfortable before I can leave. I feel this is the respectable manner to address the new owners. Also, the land contract in Pineville will need to be finalized for the purpose of logging rights. I will be along as soon as I can. We'll start packing today. It will be a lot of work to fit in all of it, but we can do it. Luke squirmed in his chair. The excitement surrounding him seemed to amount to more than he could handle. Well, let's get started, Megan agreed. I thought Emma and Megan could start here in the kitchen, Liz began. Only leave the bare minimums. Grandpa will take most of his meals at the mill with the other men. The sawdust and wooden crates are stacked in the breezeway. Pack the breakables in the sawdust and nail each lid down well. Also, think about what we will need for the next few days. We can pack those items right before we leave. We want to take as much as we can on this trip. Grandpa will only bring what he has to because all of the wagons will carry freight. Thomas watched Emma and Megan swish out the door to the breezeway, and he smiled at the way Liz had taken charge. Chapter 4. Emma gathered several of the crates from the porch. Megan struggled with a heavy bag of sawdust. She tugged with frustration on the sturdy burlap, but to her consternation it wouldn't budge. She stepped away from the bag and placed her hands tightly against her hips, her hair damp at the temples from the morning sun, which beamed straight through the open porch. Emma tapped her on the shoulder with a giggle as Liz and Abby headed to the cellar to retrieve the canned goods. The door creaked open and dusty sun rays ran ahead of Abby down the stairs. The dark place filled with light as she gathered her skirt and entered the coolness. Carefully woven cobwebs hit Abby in the face. "Ooh!" she cringed, blinking as she tried to adjust to the lack of light in her new surroundings. Wooden shelves were on all sides, bulging with stone crocks and canned goods. The pantry brimmed with peaches, dried apples, tomatoes, and several sacks of onions and potatoes. "You Mayleys are excellent gardeners," Abby told Liz, "and equally blessed in your canning skills." Abby squealed when she found a stockpile of the special jam that had caused such a stir at breakfast. "We won't have to worry about a berry patch in Texas for a while. After all, look what I found." Even though it was the end of the season, the cellar was still full. Liz and Megan had prepared their harvest well. "You and Megan have grown so confident since I saw you last," Abby said as she loaded crates with canned fruits and jams. "I admire your independence you've achieved in spite of everything." Liz knew Abby had aspired to attain such independence as a teacher, but she might now have matured enough to know that kind of thing came from poise and confidence and not from vocation. Abby began to sort the abundance into categories. The shelf closest to the stairs would be for Grandpa Lucas, and she placed a sack of coffee beans and an extra jar of peaches next to the other items that Liz had requested that she set aside for him. As Liz surveyed the shelves, it looked like more than her grandfather would need, especially if he were to take his meals at the mill and with the other workers. But she decided to let Abby work on her own while she gathered a few things to tide them over the next few days. She lined up the butter crock and small block of cheese, jam, and another crock that held salt. Abby seemed impressed with Liz's organizational skills. "There will certainly be plenty of food for the trip," she observed, "and an amount sufficient to start our new home. I have to hand it to you, Elizabeth. You're really prepared to make this journey." Liz left Abby to finish sorting while she headed upstairs to check on the progress of John and Blue. They were struggling to lift some heavy prepared boxes into the freight wagons. "Miss Elizabeth, we can never get all of this in these wagons." John wiped the trickle that dripped down his face, removing one glove as he tried to explain the situation to the obstinate female before him. "John, I don't wish to be difficult, but if you would just try it this way, I'm certain it will fit. See, I have it all planned out here." She pushed her note paper towards John. He took the paper and reluctantly looked it over. "Is everything all right?" Abby asked as she joined them. Yes, Liz firmly stated. As soon as he completes it my way. They laughed gently as Liz noticed that John had been arranging the boxes her way, and she quietly delighted in the fact that they looked like they might fit into their predestined locations. A short while later, Liz and Abby approached the kitchen area, and laughter could be heard from the two working together inside. "What is so funny, dear sister?" Abby asked Emma. Coming up for air, Emma stumbled with her words. Megan came to her aid and said, "She was telling me about the school picnic and the gift you received." "Oh, I don't want to even think about little Samuel and the snake." Abby waved her hands and changed the topic. "I've worked up such an appetite in the cellar with all of that food. I must eat something. And by the way, Liz, you and Megan have really outdone yourselves. The cellar is packed with jar after jar. Emma, you wouldn't believe it. Here is the most beautiful jar of pickles I have ever seen. Did you ever enter these in the county fair?" "Yes, we did, and we gained several new enemies throughout the county," Megan teased. "Grandma Claire always had the purple ribbon until we came along. Lonnie Gluffer said his wife was right glad we're leaving. She just might have a chance at it now." "Oh my, then. These must be worth a lovely fortune." Abby held the jar high and admired it as the light caressed the shiny glass. Secret spices and seeds floated in and around the perfect slices of little cucumbers. Casual bootsteps sounded on the front porch to announce Thomas's arrival for lunch. "I've just been chatting with John and Blue out front," he declared from the breezeway. "It appears that Miss Elizabeth has a celestial list from which they're not allowed to deviate. Do I have that right?" "And?" Liz remarked. "And nothing, I suppose," he said with a grin. I saw Caleb wind up on the losing end of that argument many times." He removed his hat and walked into the kitchen. "Looks like the family pickle secret is about to be shared. Should I come back?" "Of course not. Come in," Megan invited, smiling at him. "We're about to have lunch. Won't you join us?" "Thank you, but I have a lot to do today. Liz, may I see you on the porch for a moment?" Thomas held the door open for Liz, and she followed him outside. "Thomas, if this is about John, I can't imagine the problem," she stated firmly. "It's quite simple. The crates were not fitting in the wagon as I planned, and it was because he wanted to do it his way. We have a lot to pack, and it will not all fit if such things are not considered. I even had the crates made a certain size so that we would not waste 1 inch of room in the wagons. If they do not place them as I recorded on the sheet of paper, it simply won't work. I did it to save them time and trouble." "I think they figured it out, Liz, if you had let them." "I think they would have figured it out, Liz, if you would have let them." "But why should they waste time figuring this out when I already have?" she asked, not really seeking a response. "They would then tell me I couldn't take all the items, and that is unacceptable. Those crates are life or death." She paused, seething at the expression on his face. "I'll tell you what, Thomas, I'll load it all myself if it weren't so heavy." Liz felt her blood begin to boil, infuriated that Thomas had obviously attributed her words to a silly woman's drama. Their life might well depend on what she made room for and where she chose to store it. In fact, Megan was starting her dress shop in Fort Worth, and she had to have her supplies, as well as the inventory for the mercantile. This was no easy task that her grandfather had given her. "Let's not pretend the real problem is that I told him what to do and he wouldn't have it." Liz stared at Thomas, but he didn't respond. "Am I not right? Are the crates fitting?" Liz held her ground like an animal defending her young, her lace-up boots pressed firmly against the porch. She watched him as Thomas looked over to the 2 freight wagons. The crates appeared to fit in their designated places with no wasted space. Surely he could see that. He looked back to the covered porch, probably estimating the space of the remaining freight. "All right, then, I'll have a word with the boys." Thomas turned and walked down the steps, and Liz headed back to the kitchen. "Men," she silently exclaimed. Thomas stood by the wagons and examined the final boxes to be loaded. "You came out well on that one," Blue groaned as he lifted one of the crates into the wagon. Thomas remained silent. "What does she have in this one?" Blue complained as he wiped the sweat from his face and neck with his red bandana. "I might need a hand here, fellas." "No, this one. It can't be that heavy." "It's Megan's fabric on the side," John answered back, confused. "Well, it's rather heavy, I'm telling you." Thomas looked toward the boxes on the porch that still awaited placement in the wagon. On the side of each box, "Megan's fabric, freight wagon 2, had been boldly written. Thomas swung his leg over the back of his horse. He had rather enjoyed the little joust with Liz. It would be his life if any of it were left behind. "Boys, don't forget any of these," Thomas reminded the men as he rode away laughing. "It's apparently life or death." The days passed quickly, and the wagons began to groan as they adjusted to their new weight. Everything had been loaded except for Megan's treadle machine. A special area had been created for it with ties to hold it in place and keep it from moving around on the trail. The work had taken less time than Liz had anticipated, and she felt relieved that they would leave on time. The ladies would take a break all afternoon to finish their personal agendas and rest some. If time permitted, they planned to quilt around the old frame. Otherwise, they would get an early start and quilt the next day. Liz and Abby sat in the rockers on the porch. Megan stood by the treadle machine while Emma sat in a straight-back chair with quilt blocks in her lap. All of the square patch units had been completed, and she meticulously pieced the triangle units that would go on the sides. 2 triangle pieces were sewn to a red square, which created a large triangle unit that was then sewn to the 9 patch. The fabric remained consistent throughout the quilt, except for the center squares, which varied in shades of red and green. Liz noted that Emma seemed at her best with a needle and fabric in her hand, calm and at ease with the world. They rocked and waited in utter silence for the men to load the treadle. Abby broke into Liz's thoughts. "I have something for everyone. Being the school teacher that I am, I thought we should record our trip west." She reached into her apron pocket and took out a little journal for each of them. "I have already started mine. In fact, I've been keeping one since I went away to teach school. We should do it for ourselves, but for history too." Abby handed a small pencil to each one, just as she had no doubt done 1,000 times in her classroom. Abby was a natural teacher, encouraging, patient, and persistent. "Write whatever you wish. It's your story." "How exciting," Megan cried, always the first to respond to something new. "I've never kept a diary before." "Abby, what a lovely idea. I would never have thought of it myself," Liz agreed. Emma placed her book in her sewing bag at the side of her chair. She quickly picked up her needle again and returned to her stitching. "Thank you," she replied indifferently. "Oh, come now, Emma, it will be fun," Megan begged her cousin. All of the ladies except Megan rocked in silence and waited for the men to arrive to provide the muscle to load the treadle. She paced around the machine like a mother hen. And that ends chapter 3 and 4. We'll be ready to start chapter 5 tomorrow and page 50. I hope you're enjoying the story of the women, Liz and Megan, 2 sisters, with their cousins, Abby and Emma, 2 sisters, as they load the wagons and start their journey. We'll see you at the next story hour. Bye-bye.